Welcome to a podcast from the 43rd Annual Conference of the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions at Hunter College. The conference took place on April 3rd, 4th, and 5th of 2016 at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gail Brooks. I am the moderator for this panel, which is America's Public Regional Universities Collective Bargaining Matters. And before we go into any conversation, I want to remind you that this particular session is being broadcast. So if you will turn off your cell phones, and we will try very hard to make sure that we speak clearly. And
it'll be a podcast.
It'll be podcast. Okay, we will be podcast. So I am retired and failed that. I'm working at Cal State. I'm working at Cal State Fullerton temporarily, but I was the Vice Chancellor for Human Resources and Labor Relations at the California State University System Office. And so this particular topic is very interesting to me, having four-year degree granting universities, the largest in the country, and at a system office dependent upon good data in order to make decisions. So it's axiomatic today that we are in a data-rich environment. However, the question is, do we have the right data? Do we have the right information? And what decisions are we making based on the data that we do have? Our panelists will look at institutional peer data, which they assert will tell a more accurate story based on geography and the disaggregation of regional public universities from all 4 years. They'll also talk about why it matters and its implications for the users of such data. Let me introduce our distinguished panelists. At the far end is Dr. Stephen Katsinas, Director of the Educational Policy Center, Professor of Higher Education Administration at the University of Alabama. Next to me, Terry Curry, Associate Provost, Associate Vice President for Academic Human Resources, Professor, School of Human Resources and Labor Relations, Michigan State University. And finally, Fred Floss, Professor of Economics and Finance at SUNY Buffalo State and Director of the Buffalo Fiscal Stability Board, which provides financial oversight over the budgets, financial plans, and capital plan of the city of Buffalo. Excuse me. Dr. Katsinas will present his research. Are there handouts?
Right here.
Okay, we've got handouts on the table. And the research is called Monetary Compensation for Faculty at America's Public Regional Universities. Does collective bargaining matter? Dr. Floss and Mr. Curry will respond with additional data and the implications for practitioners, respectively.
Great.
We plan to leave plenty of time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And forgive my classes, I had an accident today coming in. But it's a pleasure and privilege to be with you. This is my 10th out of 11 years to be here at this meeting, and it's a wonderful group. What we're going to talk about is background methodology. Yeah, go ahead, please hand out, give the handouts too, because I think it'll help me more through, because we are in a data-rich environment. We'll talk about the background methodology, findings, and implications. And let's start with past studies of monetary compensation began with the Committee Z of AAUP in 1919. TIA jumped into the game, authoring large-scale salary and fringe benefit studies. The TIA first study was actually in 1939. They came back again in 1948, 59, and 69. They looked initially just at four-year nonprofit privates and public four-year. They realized they missed the two-year sector, so they commissioned a separate study in 71 that Francis King did, And then Frank King and Cook's TIA-funded study looked at 2- and 4-year institutions, public and nonprofit, in 1980. And that was their last study. IPEDS ended up collecting, which Federal Department of Ed began collecting through their Human Resources Survey, fringe benefit and salary data in 1985-86. So because of that, there wasn't a need for TIA to get back in the game to come back and look at this later. The AAUP's methodology began in the early 70s. They came out at about the time the Carnegie classifications were first being developed by Clark Kerr and grabbed that. And that's going to be a big theme to this whole discussion that you're about to hear, is how accurate are the Carnegie classifications. AFT, NEA, AUP, SEIU, all are concerned with contingent benefits, but today few are studying fringe benefits, and that's 30% of the total. This hits me personally. My wife and I adopted 2 children while we were at the University of Toledo through Lucas County Children's Services. We had a heck of a tough time with the benefits that we had at our university in Texas. And when I went through the University of Alabama, I arranged part of my interview to meet with the benefits people. And I was shocked when they said that the purpose of the benefits program was to benefit the employees of the University of Alabama. But my daughter had a lot of mental health issues. She had 6 psychiatric hospitalizations. So this hit me in a big way. And so benefits matter, and that kind of propelled some of my own personal interest in this. I don't think you know monetary compensation if you leave out 30% of the total compensation. Within the community college sector, last year presented a paper very similar in its data approach to what you're going to see today. The geographic missions not accounted for. The service delivery areas are assigned by statute. Small sample size, just 20% of the 1,028 community colleges are reported in AAUP salary study. Local funding's not accounted for, and that masks great differences. Within the 4-year sector, again, the geographic mission is not accounted for. Now, they're called regional universities. That connotes a commitment to place. We're also seeing the mixing of missions. The Department of Education, when they publish data on faculty salaries, they mix all 4-year together as if the teaching workload at a flagship is the same as the teaching workload at a regional. I don't believe that to be the case. So the workloads are not accounted for. This is the AAUP's model. It really plays right off of Carnegie with doctoral, master's, bachelor's, associates. So what a lot of people, when they look at this, don't see is what's the logic behind the Carnegie classification that we've been using year after year after year. We accept that as a proposition without even thinking about it. What's not known is that there are 390 members of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. 120 of them are not Carnegie master's institutions. They're spread across other sectors. Okay? They serve 1.4 million students. That's not a small number. So in the 2-year sector, this is how the urbanicity definition that was put into play by the department in the early Bush years that they still use and the foundations are using right now in that sector. And if you were an Ivy League trained political scientist, sociologist, or economist and you showed up at a foundation as a 20-something in your first job, you'd put your money here and you wouldn't put your money there. And that's something that I've learned. Now my work, so that we put my bona fides out there, I'm the lead author with 2 other people of what Carnegie did use in its 2005 and 2010 classification of the associate sector for its basic classification. We believe geography matters. Carnegie wanted to pull out and did 113 2-year colleges that they didn't classify geographically. So what we've been busy doing within the 2-year sector is to reclassify and put all the associates back together, and then we're coming back with the research we're going to talk about today to do the same thing for the regionals. We think it's important for a couple reasons. Number one is, where are the community college students going to transfer to? They're likely to go to the regional universities. We found with I'm now moving to our State Directors of Community Colleges survey, and on the front page of the handout, it includes access to the January 2016 report from which this graph is pulled. And what this question is post-Great Recession blues, how many times did the state appropriate to hit the inflation rate in each year after the Great Recession? Because you could be in a period of historic low inflation, but if your inflation rate's 2.8% and you have an increase of PROP of 1%, and you do that enough years, you're going to lose purchasing power. Just 2 states, Republican Utah and Democratic Massachusetts, hit it every time. 5 states didn't hit it at all. We think that's not unimportant. Another graph that you see here is that but let me get back to this one. We're asking the wrong question. The wrong question is not, did the legislature appropriate increases or not? The right question is, did they appropriate it to the inflation rate? And we've got to change that dynamic, is one thing I would say. Now, the proponents of high tuition, high aid say every time you raise tuition, you need to raise your state student aid budget. We asked the biggest proponent of high tuition, high aid the last 30 years was David Longenecker, ran WICHE, used to work for the first Clinton administration. He said there had to be alignment of state appropriations, state student aid, and tuition. This map shows the policies are just flat and out of line. And so this is pushing people out because when they don't appropriate enough money, the practical choice on the campus is to raise tuition, cut programs and services, or both. There's only so much internal inefficiency you're going to squeeze out of the thing. And so we've got to ask the right questions. But Delta Cost Project, AAUP, are all using the Carnegie topology. So what the problems that are embedded in that impact the lens that you view. So let's turn to the actual data itself. Salary and fringe benefits data come from IPEDS. The last year IPEDS collects the data. They quit collecting it. Okay? Now I'm old enough to remember working for Mr. Simon when Mr. Reagan declared ketchup to be a vegetable, and we dealt with hunger in America by getting rid of half of the people inside the Department of Agriculture that collected the statistics. And I don't know if we're seeing an instant replay, but I worry about that. The geography, we basically applied the same urban, suburban, and rural to the regional sector. If the metropolitan area was 500,000 or more, it was urban or suburban. If it was outside, it was rural. If it was inside the central city, and it has to be the physical address of the institution, not the mailbox, then it's urban or suburban. So they can't choose where they land. And we included the entire universe of regional universities, and we didn't leave out the ones that serve so many students. And then we used the Director of Collective Bargaining for 2012. And now I'd like to turn to the handout because the data are there's too much there, and it's easier for you to follow the next part of what I'm going to say with the handout than it is to look at a PowerPoint. So let's first, table 1 just shows the states with and without collective bargaining. If a majority of the regional universities had collective bargaining, it got counted as a collective bargaining state. And you see the 20 right-to-work states like mine on the right. The second table looks at institutions. So table 2 shows how the 390 institutions fell out. Most are rural, 261. 67%, 14% are suburban, 19% are urban. Of the 390, 219, 56% have collective bargaining, 171 do not. And then below the first third of that chart is within the geographic type. It shows that it's basically a 50-50 split for the rurals. It's 75-25 for the suburbans. It's 60-40 for the urbans. And then across the types, you can see how ye with and without collective bargaining differ. Of course, at the University of Alabama, we care a lot about rankings, so we rank the 7 topics, 7 and suburban large, suburban small, rural small, urban small, urban large, rural medium. Look at table 3. And we had so much data I couldn't share it all with you. To do this, you have to classify the institutions, then you look at the faculty, then you look at the dollars. But you have to look at the dollars for salary, then the dollars for fringe benefit, then you can put your salary and fringe benefit together. There is no other way to do it, at least to do it right, I think. So table 3, what you see is how the full-time faculty break out. 127,222 of them, 71,863 are employed at the rurals, 21,235 at the suburban, and 34,034 at the urban regionals. That's 56, 17, and 27% respectively. 63% of the faculty work at the 219 regionals with collective bargaining, 37% don't. So one of the things we see when you include the universe is it's about a 2-to-1 ratio of faculty at these institutions with collective bargaining versus those without. Now, I think this might be the most accurate picture that's been done of this sector to my knowledge, period. $7 billion, the total salary and fringe benefits is $11.8 billion, about $9 billion in salary, about $2.7 billion in fringe benefits. When you round the figures, you get 11.8. $7.1 billion was spent on monetary compensation at the 219 institutions with collective bargaining, and a rank of the geographic types with collective bargaining. There was a tie between the 2 suburban rankings. Then urban large, rural small, urban small, rural medium, and rural large were in a tie. Let's look at table 4, which is salaries. And here, for your convenience, I put the number of colleges and the number of faculty and the percentage with and without collective bargaining on the left, so then you could see the data table on the right and see what you're comparing it to. The paper that you'll read, I came up with 3 fictitious faculty who were meeting for their 10-year reunion, wondering why were they paid so differently. If you see under where it says all under average salaries, you can see that you have a high of $77,000 at the urban large, and a small rural medium gets 60. But when you pull collective bargaining in and out, look at how those differences change. And that, to me, is a big piece of this paper. Because what you see is you could be making $59,079 at a rural small and get $79,000 for the same work at a suburban institution, and you can't explain that just in housing costs. Housing costs are there, but you can't explain the whole picture with just the differences in housing costs. 1-year differences get into the 20%. Table 5 looks at, and so again, averages mask large differences across time. Table 5 looks at fringe benefits. I like health benefits. They're cool. Again, I work at a university that they said that the purpose of the benefits plan was to benefit the employees. I had to put it, we self-insured, we paid Blue Cross Blue Shield. My daughter required 13 months of being in a facility. The university, instead of me being billed and reimbursing me, which was a $10,500 a month deal, just did the billing straight up. They made a friend with me, okay? And all I'm here to tell you is that I'm not the only one out there like that. So we're making a big mistake to look at it. Another thing we discovered, and I'm not going to get into this later, But I have my son married an older gal, and now they have 2 kids about to hit college. And we were pricing out the colleges, and for someone who's taught higher ed and political science for a number of years, it was kind of an interesting thing. 2 years, the kids are 1 year apart. It'll cost them, so they'll have 3 years where both of them are in college. My son is a general manager of a restaurant. His wife's a nurse. $230,000 to do over 5 years to go full time and live on campus at the University of Alabama. $170,000 to do the same thing at the regional. Different prices if you live at home for 2 years and transfer. This is a benefits issue this group might get concerned about. Many regionals don't have tuition-dependent benefit. You know why? Because when that thing got put in the early 70s, the tuition was so low, no one cared. It's not an expensive benefit. As bad as the finances are at Eastern, Jeffrey, that's one benefit that wouldn't bust the bank. So one of the things that this research can do over time is to look at all these below the big benefits things that you can negotiate on top of this basic salary and insurance and that kind of thing. So I want to make sure I put that out there. 1 year impact of collective bargaining, $9,984. Look at the spread. 74,000 faculty with collective bargaining are getting $31,000 in fringe benefits. The 52,000 without are getting $21,700. Probably better life over time. And the averages, again, are masking large differences. So now we're to the big one, the last table, total monetary compensation on the back. And what you see here is that so this one puts it all together. Again, 11.8 billion spent. And what you see is the average monetary compensation is $97,176. If you have collective bargaining, it's $105. If you don't, it's $84. If you look at these types and spread them out over a 30-year career, you're talking about it can approach $1 million. Now, what happens if we go into a period of higher inflation? Okay, that's possible. So what are the implications? One is we need to disaggregate the data. Regional university data should be disaggregated from research mission-driven flagship data. I think that's long overdue, but someone has to get under the hood to do it. We didn't get it all the way done in Alabama, and we're going to have to figure out a way, and I'm going to be looking to you all for some help. So we're going to have some money to be able to do this. Geography matters. We see picking at peer institutions for all of the benchmarking for college degree completion and other stuff like that. We don't want to be comparing a CSU Fullerton to a University of California, Berkeley. The collective bargaining matters, and the rural institutions are going to need some focus, particularly in the high poverty areas of the country. Other implications, we're on our own. The federal government quit collecting the data. No one from TIA and the Ford Foundation basically funded all of the pre-iPad studies. I think we're going to have to figure out how to find a friend to fund somebody to do this, because boards of trustees, faculty, HR officers, business officers still need good data to put together good compensation plans. It was interesting to read the forward of the 1980 report where Greenlaw, who was involved with TIA for the first 4 of their studies, was talking about what the great progress we made, because in 1939, just 10% of faculty had benefits, and we were in a ballgame where virtually all had retirement. So I hope we're not moving back. So I'd like to see a large study. I believe NSF and IH ought to care about the science, STEM, health pathway, and that might be another place that could be interested in it. We certainly need secondary analysis on the high poverty regions. We need secondary analysis for the sparsely populated areas. The planners of American higher ed in the late 50s knew it was going to cost more to educate people per FTE in rural New York State or rural Wyoming than it did in urban because you don't have economies of scale. These aren't new issues. And we need to start looking at compensation across the 2- and 4-year access sectors. One limitation to the data is that if you're a CSU system and you go out to negotiate a health benefit, you have a much bigger economy of scale than if in Eastern Illinois is doing it themselves. The TIA studies had the expertise to tease that out in their time. We need to do that in our time. I would also say that to tell the access story is going to require new frames that localize the data. And we certainly ought to be looking at adjusting for inflation. I come back to this AAUP. This is your Carnegie nomenclature. And is this accurate? You have a right to ask that question. This is the 2016, and so what's the quick and dirty on Carnegie? It's this. It's a 4x3 scheme of public, private, nonprofit, and for-profit that then looks at and it's a highest degree awarded scheme. So you can move up. And what you see here on the right is the average research dollars for the 3 highest Carnegie doctoral. Now this is what Alexander Aston was talking about many years ago when he talked about the pecking order. Remember that? Some of you are my age and can remember that. But the highest research dollar average is $319 million a year, $39 million in the middle, $5.7 million on the side. Now, on the far right of this slide, you can see what I predict some of the faculty teaching workload might be. And that is, I could see a lot of the RU1s being 1-1, 1-2, 2-2. I could see the low-end doctorates being 2-3. Community colleges are typically 5-5. I would guess the regionals are at 4-4, 4-3. So we're not just comparing Gila apples to Rome apples. We're comparing cucumbers and apples. And we have to keep that in mind. What's happened is Carnegie has become less accurate. In the community college sector, their bachelor's, the newest 2016 one they just released last month, 2015, includes 166 baccalaureate associates colleges that they say award enough bachelor's degrees so that the community college is in this category. So the same bleeding is on both sides of the thing. Okay? Now, over on the right, I tell you where I think we need to go. I think we need to think of flagships, regionals, and community colleges. I think we need to have geographic classification within the access sectors. I think that we still need to capture the privates with non-selective and selective liberal arts and large and small universities and our for-profit friends 2- and 4-year. That's where I think it could go. But I know this is inaccurate. This is the Bush administration one when the gentleman who's now running Lumina was in Washington running a think tank. This is what they came up with. And I think that localized data, closing thought, localizing pure data has always been the goal. This is a quote from the 1919 AAUP Bulletin announcing its new Committee on Economic Status of the Profession, Committee Z. And it's actually big enough type where I can read it if I turn around without these big things. While the problem is primarily a local one and must be dealt with by local efforts, the association can doubtless render some valuable aid to these efforts by calling general attention to the gravity of the situation and by collecting information which will be of use to its local committees. So appropriate peer data has always been the goal. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.
While they're getting set up, there's a question I would like you to think about that we could discuss at the end of these presentations, and that is, do you agree with this proposed approach? to the collection of data. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Steve. I just want to preface my remarks with that a lot of what I'm going to do here today is preliminary. I got Steve's report like February 1st, February 2nd, and started to work on some of the data and some of the ideas really only over the last couple of weeks. And so the idea here is more to give you an idea of where I think some of the work we need to do if we're going to work along with Steve and some of the issues that he brings up. So what caught my eye in Steve's report, and he showed it to you there before, was his map on whether or not inflation mattered. And he talked about the HEPI, but I teach public finance, and I know of no state government that knows what HEPI is, let alone tries to consider it. So I changed the question to whether or not they even look at the consumer price index as we talk about here. And I think you're going to be not necessarily surprised by the results, but maybe a little bit surprised by what's going on. So Steve's major things were averaging wage and benefits across universities masks great differences, and they're going to mask differences because there's differences in CPIs across states and across urban and regional and other things, so that if we're going to start to talk about collective bargaining, we have to have a decent understanding of inflation and where it fits all of the categories that we're talking about. So hopefully starting to talk about this will get us to a better place in collective bargaining and later get us to a better place when we go to our state legislators for both administrators and unions and associations to actually start to have a good discussion to try to change some of the things that we're looking at. So looking at that, the question really came down to his page 9 in his PowerPoint, which was this diagram, which basically said, well, over the last 5 years, since the Great Recession, that only 2 states had hit HEPI. Well, from my perspective, let's ask some other questions, that this is really just a starting point. Because we need to say, well, did tuition replace state support? Were the economies growing at different rates, and maybe that's masking some of this? What else is going on? So I'm going to try a little bit here to do a very simple way of looking at this and start to ask, do budget models in general in the states basically take either the business cycle, that we were in a recession or not in a recession, or whether or not, okay, is that okay? I mean, if you want it darker, that's fine by me. My students usually work in the dark. I teach econometrics and we write on the board. We don't even use PowerPoints anymore and everything's in the dark. So I'm used to it. But what kind of models do they use? And there are really 2 different kinds that public finance faculty talk about. Incremental budgets, which essentially say, here's what you got last year, we're going to give you some percentage. That's going to be very critical if we're going to talk about CPI and whether or not they use CPI. Because if they're going to give us a percentage, but they're not going to give us the CPI, we have a real problem because now we have a compounding problem. So missing CPI for 5 years doesn't just impact the 5 years where we're talking about CPI, but in fact, since they're going to grow it every year on what the base was, you're going to get this widening and widening gap, which will put a lot more fiscal stress on any of our university and college systems. The other kind, and I'll show you that I'm almost as old as Steve is that we cut by calling it zero-based budgeting, which was in fact a Johnson administration term, which essentially said that budgets needed to be looked at probably every 3 to 5 years and analyzed for need. And therefore we would rotate through. Some programs would get smaller, other programs would get bigger. But in fact, we would look at need, we would look at fiscal stress in other issues. I know of no state that uses zero-based budgeting, And I think we're going to be able to show you that in a second. So if all of these states are using these incrementals, and we need to at least hit the CPI, if not hit the HEPI, if we're not going to get what Steve talks about in his paper, which is fiscal stress. So that this is a way of looking and trying to measure the concept of fiscal stress and how bad, and forecasting out how bad it will be over time since the Great Recession if we look at it. So what I did, and again, I'm going to apologize for not maybe breaking down the data as well as Steve does, but I basically had a week and a half. So this was my best shot at using some of the data that Steve uses. The state support data, the tuition data, enrollment data for states are relatively easy to get. And then looking at GDP and the consumer price index. So what we're really doing here is state support depends on tuition, enrollment, the growth in the state, and the CPI. So we're going to be able to say, if tuition went up, did that lower or raise state support? So is tuition actually basically taking the place of state support? Are states looking at enrollment? So if you have more students, are they going to give you more money or not? GDP, how fast is the economy growing? Does that matter here to be able to take about state support? And why I put all three of those in, where I'm really interested in the CPI, is that I want to control for those things so that I can say the only thing that matters when I look at the coefficient for CPI is inflation alone. So are they looking at inflation alone? So let's sit down and look at that. Well, I'm going to use a 95% statistical level. It's not going to matter. They are either very much statistically significant or not at all statistically significant in any of the states or any of the years that I look at. In the tables that are going to come, if it's an N, that means it's not statistically significant. If it's an X, that means it is statistically significant. If there's a minus sign in front of it, it says that there's an inverse relationship, which is going to get scary in some cases because there are some states where inflation goes up, state support goes down. Okay, and I think that's probably one of the scarier things that we can look at here when we go on. Now, why did I use N and X's? Because Steve used N and X's. So don't blame me. Okay? Very quickly, I'm only putting these up, and I've got three of them so you can find your state and see what happened to your state. So in the United States, notice that tuition was, when we looked at all of the states all together, basically what we got was tuition was inversely related but not statistically significant. Okay? Enrollment didn't matter. Okay? So if you get more students, that's great. You're not getting more state support. GDP was significant. That goes back to our incremental kind of budgeting. As the state does better, they give you your percentage, you make some more money. And interesting, the CPI was not statistically significant for everybody, and it was the wrong sign. But we explained 92% of the differences in state support among different states, just using this very simple model. And then what I did was each of those for all years from 2000 to 2014. Looking at that, I've also split it apart from 2000 to 2008 and 2008 to 2014. It doesn't matter. I'll show you except for one case here, but it mattered all together. But you can see that we're explaining pretty well. So the first group of people here from those states got to see it. Here's the next group of states. You can look for a second and see where you are in all of this. Interestingly, North Dakota is statistically significant for the CPI, but it has the wrong sign. So that's saying that the higher the inflation rate, the less North Dakota is actually going to give you in state support. So we can start to look at that. Here's the final group if you want to look for your state there. You'll see Wyoming will turn out to be the second state that decides it's a good idea that when inflation goes up that you cut state support, and is statistically significant. So if we look at all of these together for the CPI, basically 48 states don't take the CPI into consideration other than growth in GDP, other than what we would normally predict in a standard public finance budget model and incremental financing. Now that becomes, I think, fairly critical because this becomes the importance, I think, of unions and administrators in unions working together. Because obviously the only way you're going to change that is to go into the legislative process and use your political power and your organizing power to be able to do something about that. To this point, we're not doing that. At this point, we're just like everybody else. It doesn't matter who we are, what we're doing, we're just like everybody else. We're just like cat food. You know, price goes up so much per year, and that's all that's going on and all of that. And I think that that becomes important too, because we're not able to make the case of what our institutions are all about if we don't have a better classification system that we can use to come up with better arguments to show local legislators that might be in an urban or a rural setting what the issues are for them and why it matters to them. So that this is all really trying to support that whole picture of what we're going through and looking through all of that. Okay? So, you know, Steve started out talking about collective bargaining matter and just to faculty with benefits and everything else that we've done. But it's also, as I say here, that unions matter because they have political power. So collective bargaining matters because there's an ability to use political power that we won't otherwise have if we're dispersed and we're thinking of ourselves as individuals instead of a collective. And so I think we're seeing that it works at the bargaining table. If we can transfer that over to legislatures, then we're going to be able to start to relieve some of that fiscal stress, and it's probably going to be easier then to negotiate contracts as well. The other thing I want to do is look at something, and I wanted to show you this because this is sort of scary. So on the bottom here is total tax revenue by a state, and here's state support. So I switched from GDP to tax revenue. This is how much money they have. And if you start to look at it, while most of our states are down there, and California's in New York are up towards the top, what's important is here's 2008, here's 2000. Does everybody see that the percentage is exact? The lines are on top of each other. And if, in fact, I went back and did 2002, 4, 6, 8, up to the Great Recession, this line is right on top of itself for every year. We got the same sort of percentage increase every year as everybody else. We did not lose ground. Since the Great Recession, and I didn't put 12, but 12 is somewhere in the middle here because it looked messy, is that we've actually seen a drop of our percentage. Okay? So we're now getting a smaller percentage of tax revenue than we had before and basically for the last 15 years. So that this is a fundamental change that we have to sit down and start to address if we want to think about it. So I just said all that. Here's 2008, 2004 showing you just again. And the other interesting part here is about 14 of the states down here didn't move. Nothing matters. They just give you a certain almost fixed amount of money. And that's it. That there is no relationship between enrollments or how well or badly the state's doing or anything else. They essentially just give you a certain amount of money and that's it. So as we...
If I could, because I think you put that back on, is that in another piece of work that I've done, and my co-authors surveying these state community college directors, we talked about how it went from hang with us till the recession's over, eat inflation, enrollment growth, we'll take care of you when the recession's over, to here's the money, deal with it, and we're not going to give you any more. And you're proving that, and it's fascinating to see that proven. Forgive me, I apologize.
No. One last thing I want to talk about, because I'm an economist and Bommel's an economist, is something called Bommel's disease. And I don't know if any of you know about it, but Bommel's disease in economics parlance is a fairly well-known issue. The paper came out that he wrote in 1956, so it's been around for a long time. And when he started, it was why records were replacing symphony orchestras and the demise of music in the United States as he saw it. And today he still thinks there's been the demise of music in the United States as he sees it. But his basic argument was simply this, was that things that are highly labor intensive, and higher education is highly labor intensive, will first be forced to the public sector from the private sector because you can't make a profit on something that's highly labor intensive. And then, essentially what will happen is that it will get more expensive and it will grow at a faster rate than the CPI. Because wages grow faster because you don't have productivity enhancements. So now what do we see? We see everybody from Bill Gates to Lumina to Obama and everybody trying to replace us with the newest version of a MOOC. I had a professor, my thesis advisor, sort of laughed at MOOCs. He said, I did MOOCs in 1962. It was called Sunrise University. We had 10 graduate students that sat in front of the television screen, and if you had a question, you called in. And he said, it didn't work then, and it's not going to work now. And I think that as we start to look at all of this, the problem is that we have everybody thinking that the solution is that we should become capital intensive. And the more they spend money on trying to make us capital intensive, the less money we have for things that are working, which is an interesting question. And it stops us from making the arguments that we need to make to the legislature. So we have to acknowledge that this is what the case is, and that there may not be a solution of some kind of new computerized robot that will be able to teach the world from Mars or something like that as we go through all of this. So just in summing up, I think Steve makes a lot of important points in his paper and his work that he's done over the last few years, and I think it's a roadmap that we need to start to use if we're going to be able to come up with solutions that are going to help for higher education in general. And that it's important to realize that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to all of this. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to go low-tech, sitting down. I'm going to follow the advice of a famous New Yorker, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who said, when you're giving remarks, just three things: be sincere, be brief, and be seated. I'm already seated. And I'm going to give you a perspective from a non-economist, from the labor relations, human resources guy who worries in the Provost's office about attracting and retaining talent. And sits at the table on occasion with our non-tenure track faculty, negotiating over those issues. And as I do that, first, let me say how much I appreciate the work that Steve and his colleagues have done on a very important issue, and on a number of the things Steve said, I couldn't agree more. So suggestions about breaking out salary data by geographic location and by cost of living would be so helpful to us when it comes to retaining candidates and attracting candidates, to be able to do comparative analysis around institutional types that are similar. So we are a flagship institution. We're recruiting nationally for talent, for candidates to be able to easily and readily factor in cost of living data when they're looking at the salary offers that we're making versus other institutions, other campuses elsewhere. And if you think especially about those that are land-grant institutions that are often located in more rural areas, but they are flagships, again, to have salary data weighted by cost of living would be helpful to candidates as they're making decisions, and certainly for us as we're negotiating with candidates and as we are talking with our unions and our faculty, and whether it's through the faculty governance process or the collective bargaining process about those issues. Stephen, in his paper, talked about adding workload mix, workload and salary to the mix, and it would be extremely helpful but extremely difficult. As you know, within institutions, not only across institutions, there's just too little standardization of teaching loads as a starting point. It varies from department to department, from discipline to discipline. When we sit with faculty or we are talking about this at the bargaining table, you quickly get into issues of, well, is it a graduate course or is it an undergraduate course? Is it a large lecture? Is it a small seminar? Is it an online course versus a face-to-face versus a hybrid? Is it a new prep, or is this something I've taught multiple times, that when you start talking about evaluations, well, is it a required course or is it an elective course? Is it an 8 o'clock in the morning course? A course is not a course is not a course. If AAUP could break out salary data separately for tenure system faculty versus our non-tenure track faculty, from my institution's perspective, it would be extremely beneficial. The wage differential between the two groups makes an average salary or an average salary and benefits statistic. It's just not very meaningful. And so the conversations that we have at the bargaining table or through the academic governance process would be much more meaningful conversations, much more informed conversations if we had that help from AAUP. Stephen's colleagues also talked about looking at salary data by discipline, and you mentioned specifically STEM fields and other high wage, high demand fields. Again, would be very helpful, but I suspect very, very difficult to do. We know the salary differences by discipline are substantial. Those of us who are in faculty positions know if we were advising our children and they were going to be a faculty member and that was going to be the source of their livelihood and they were just doing it for the money. You major in finance, you major in accounting, you major in economics, you don't major in English, you don't major in history. The difference is in it. But we're doing it for love. I guess good news. At least my colleagues in our Office of Institution Research say that this year AAUP has made a number of changes to their survey. They're going to be looking at benefits by gender and rank in ways that they haven't in the past. If that happens and if that continues, then I look forward to the work that Steve and his colleagues will be able to do using that improved data. And then the last thing, the core of the paper, the title of the paper is about the impact of collective bargaining on salaries, on benefits, and you've done a great job of identifying it and putting a number to it. Some would get into an argument about, do we have causality here, or do we have a correlation here? But my experience suggests that whatever number you come up with, however refined your statistics are, is going to be an understated number. And the reason is, in those cases in which some institutions are unionized and some are not, and we are competing for talent, the salary and benefits negotiated by those institutions that are unionized affect what happens at the other institutions. So the salaries at the non-unionized institutions have been impacted by what happened at the bargaining table, by the work, including the work of legislative and work that unions were doing. It probably has some impact there. So I think the likelihood is that the actual impact is higher than the statistical analysis indicates that the number is. And the fact is, and I'll end with this, just as most citizens have no sense that unions in the U.S. had anything at all to do with the fact that they have paid vacation and paid sick leave and safe working conditions and employer-provided health care. Again, the reality is that the activities and the successes of unions have pushed other institutions to match what unionized workforces have attained. So we might not be able to measure it with scientific precision beyond what Steve and his colleagues are able to do, but if you're in the trenches, you know that there is an impact, and again, I would argue probably a larger impact than the numbers suggest. So, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I asked you to think about a question. I had an opportunity to have some discussion prior to this session, and I had some disagreements. Do you agree with the approaches that we've heard today? And if not, why not? And if not, do you have some ideas what might be different?
Yep.
Steve?
So I have a question for Fred. One of the statements that you made, talking about the fact that collective bargaining has been a positive with respect to, and I'm not arguing that it shouldn't have been or that it hasn't been, but you indicated in there that in part its impact on state allocations was coming from the political work that the unions are doing. So I'm in a state, Michigan, in which it doesn't matter. In fact, every time a union opens their mouth, it hurts them in the legislature. So I'm just wondering, is that the actual political makeup of the legislature another variable that needs to be put into this?
Let me repeat that question because we are being podcast. The basic question was that you indicated that the legislature is affected by the unions in making determination of the allocation. But that doesn't seem to be the case in Michigan, where, in fact, when the unions go to the legislature, it actually hurts.
Yes, that's right.
And I've actually tried to do some organizing in Michigan, particularly around the constitutional amendment change there, and understand your question and your fears. But I think it's how the unions react to be positive. You don't have to always come out on television and be positive, and make your statements public. It may be just as important to what you do behind the scenes. So in New York, for example, you may be at one point in time bashing somebody outside carrying a sign while you're inside actually discussing and solving the problem, with the idea being none of us are going to acknowledge that this happened, but that you got some of the things that you wanted because you had this sort of dual game, if you want to play. So some of this can be theater. I think it's an important thing for unions to realize that we can't make everybody the enemy, and we have to find ways to quietly work with people who are on the other side of whatever issues we have if we're going to be successful over the long run.
I live in a right-to-work state. Last year we did the work on the community college sector, and this year the regional sector. I did not come in with just saying unions are good and that, but the data are the data. You can't get around the differences. They're there.
I'll just add, being from Michigan, which just became a right-to-work state recently, talking with colleagues in Wisconsin, which, as you know, has gone through a lot. Some of the things that Fred suggests in the and I don't, I'm trying to figure out how to say this one. In the Tea Party environment that we are in, the traditional let's work behind the scenes and get things done are tactics that have not been effective in ways that they have been previously. It is a different political environment, at least in the place that I'm in.
Thank you.
I'd just add to the conversation that I've done some research in the decade of the 90s and changes in state appropriations to public higher education, state by state, and that there is a relationship between the strength of unionization in the state and the change in appropriation. The startling thing is that it's negative, and that it's more strongly negative when it's a recessionary economy as opposed to when it's not.
So what you're saying is, based on your research, that you're finding a negative correlation to the state appropriations where there is a union
Yes.
that's gone to the legislature. Anybody want to
And
comment?
I think that may not be something that we wouldn't expect, because you would think that places that unionized were the places where people were being trampled on the most, so that they would be the ones that need the most protection. So that it doesn't surprise me necessarily that they do that. The interesting question would be, compared to what those states would have had if they hadn't had a union, that's a much harder question to answer of where they would be. And it's not something that I have an answer for here today either, because I think it is a hard question to try to tease out.
Yes, go ahead.
Going back to your question about methodology and categories, and perhaps you did this and just didn't have it in your presentation. I would like to see the data broken down. I'm Mary Ann Pacheco. I come from Rio Hondo Community College in California. I would like to see the difference between part-time and full-time faculty as part of the mix. One of the questions that one of you asked had to do with if higher education is seen as a commodity, then how do you save money on it? And I suspect that the answer has been you hire more full-time faculty, because full-time faculty do not require fringe benefits, which are very expensive. In my particular college, for each full-time faculty member, there's almost, I think it's $45,000 worth of benefits. Well, that's 25% of our faculty, but 75% of our faculty, although they receive some benefits, don't receive the full amount. So I think there's a need to put into the mix not only how big is the institution, where is the institution, what kind of an institution is it, but how do you actually break down the academic employees? And does that make a difference if they are covered under collective bargaining or not?
And if I can take that and summarize that kind of short version.
Paragraphs.
That's all right. I just want to make sure that I'm going to get it right for you, however. What you're saying is, based on methodology, you'd like to see the data broken down by full-time and part-time faculty, because full-time get benefits, and though some part-time faculty may get some benefits, it certainly doesn't measure the same cost, and that's one way that might be useful.
I would argue that your question's an excellent one. I would say I'm going to give you two pieces of an answer. Number one is IPEDS and the federal government and their human resources survey have never collected the right data on part-time faculty in the first place. That's the first part. The second part is we're likely to know less about monetary compensation, salaries, full-time, and fringe benefits of full-time faculty 5 years from now than we do today, because they quit collecting the data. Now, it's our federal government. The justification that was made on the part of the Department of Ed for why they quit collecting the data was it was an undue burden. So someone has to tell them it's not an undue burden. So one thing that I would urge all of you to do when you go home is make sure your people and the associations you represent and your institutions tell your congressmen and senators you want the data again, like they used to collect. And then you could add in the part-time at the same time and fix the problem. But I worry we're going to know less, and a lot of people my era, baby boomers, are going to be retiring soon, and we have a real crisis of hiring African American and minority faculty. We know that. That's because, and that's a federal problem. When the federal government ended the Title III Fellows Program in '77, The doctoral degree production of African Americans and Hispanics as a percent just dropped like a rock for the next 20 years. And it's such a big problem that I fear that unless the federal government gets involved in it again, as they were for about a 15, 20-year period from 58 to 78, we won't make any progress with that. So that's my sense of it.
Can I add one other thing, too, that goes along with that? Both the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Bureau of Labor Statistics is out pushing very hard because the government pushed them to stop collecting data. So anybody who works with them at all has gotten 80,000 emails from those agencies to say, please tell everybody to get data. We hear nothing from folks in education at all. So if there's going to be a push in where the data is coming from, it's going to be in labor statistics and in BEA, and probably not in education because nobody's asking for it.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, then will you help me thank these terrific panelists?
This ends a podcast from the 43rd Annual Conference of the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions at Hunter College in New York City.